Good afternoon. I'm Rich Terapak, and I'm chair of the Columbus Metropolitan Club Board of Trustees, and it's a pleasure, as always, to welcome you here today, particularly on such a nice day. Thank you all for coming inside to this dark room on a beautiful day. In case you haven't done so, as Andy asked earlier, but you probably didn't hear, please turn off your cell phones, or at least put them in a mode where you can still tweet. We encourage tweeting. Our hashtag is CMC Forum, and you can follow us at CMC at CBus Metro Club. That's all in your forum program at your seats. Let's talk, before we get into today's forum, let's talk a little bit about what's coming up. This sounds a little unusual to me, and I actually had to call and check and make sure it was true. Next Wednesday, October 31, the Royal Shakespeare Company will feature Gordon Gee, I don't know in what role, and their executive director emeritus, Vicki Haywood, plus a performance of King Lear. Now, I don't think he's doing King Lear, but it might be worth buying in. Be sure to make your reservations soon. It'll be a lot of fun. It's also Halloween. You can find information about all our upcoming CMC forums at our website, columbusmetroclub.org, and in the program. Always like to talk about membership. Members receive a discount on weekly forums and lots of other benefits. Please notice the names of attendees in today's forum flyer at your seats. Consider becoming a member and moving your name from the guest column to the member column. Speaking of members, if these folks are here, I'd like them to stand as I recognize them so we can all introduce ourselves to them later. We have some new members. Sarah Pechan of the School Choice Ohio. Sarah. Joanna Saul from Correction Institution Inspection Committee, and Karen Lurie Jones. If you're all here, if not, there we are. Welcome. If you're attending as a guest today or watching us on YouTube, I invite you to consider CMC membership. You can find more information at our website. Please think about joining CMC and supporting our important programming and forum. Sponsorship recognition. On the back of your forum today, you'll notice there are about 80 companies and organizations. These companies sponsor programs throughout the year, and in doing so, they make our forums and membership dues affordable for all of us. We really appreciate any leads you may have on folks that you think are companies or organizations who might be interested in sponsoring to see our staff. Today's program, the complete biography for each speaker is in your forum program, so I'll provide just a brief introduction. Our first speaker is a staff attorney for the Ohio Poverty Law Center who is committed to empowering low-income families and children, specifically on issues of education. Please welcome Sarah Beal. Our next speaker is a professor at the OSU Moritz College of Law and a member of the Worthington School Board, and will be next year's president of the Ohio School Boards Association in 2013. Please welcome Charlie Wilson. Our third speaker is the executive director of the Children's Defense Fund of Ohio and also combines her legal education with a passion for helping children. Please welcome Renuka Mayedev. I think I got it close. Mayedev, I got it. Serving as moderator today is another professor from OSU Moritz College of Law and teaches the Justice for Children practicum. Please welcome Kim Jordan. On behalf of CMC, welcome to all our panelists, and Kim, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here today. We have three great panelists who have just such a broad knowledge of the topic that we're here to discuss today. I know that they're going to excite you and leave you not only with a lot of information about the school-to-prison pipeline, but also leave you energized and motivated to make some changes for our school systems. You'll hear a call to action from our panelists to change Ohio laws so that we can begin to shut down the pipeline as it's running in Ohio. How many of you know a kid in elementary, middle, or high school? Almost everybody, right? Many of us have kids in the school systems. And so let's talk a little bit about what those children are seeing in their schools on a daily basis. Some of the facts include that school discipline rates are roughly double what they were in the 1970s. This increase is due not only to the increase in zero tolerance policies that we're going to discuss today, but also I think due to a change of how we think about our kids and what they're doing in schools today. An October 2011 report from the National Education Policy Center found that only 5% of suspensions nationally were for weapons or drugs, while the other 95% were for so-called disruptive behavior or other. Ohio mirrors this trend. 6% of our kids who are out of school are serving suspensions are out for weapons or drugs, only 6%. Another 64% of kids out of school due to suspension are out for other disruptive or disobedient behavior, truancy, or intimidation. Zero tolerance policies that you're going to hear about today came about for a good reason, right? Columbine scared all of us. And people got scared. People got scared of violence in school. People didn't want their kids exposed to violence in schools. It's gone too far at this point, however. They've implemented harsh guidelines against bringing anything to school that might be considered a weapon. Kids are serving suspensions and being expelled for bringing something as simple as a pair of scissors to school. Or another boy had a Boy Scout knife in his backpack from a trip that he had taken over the weekend with the Boy Scouts, forgot to take it out of his backpack, got to school, somebody found it or saw it, and he's sent out of school. He got expelled from school. In addition, these policies forbid all kinds of behavior in school without regard for individual circumstances. Sarah's going to tell you about a young lady that she represented who was disciplined for failing to put her books on the floor when she was told to. Zero tolerance lead to school pushout, suspensions, expulsions, arrest. And have kids really changed so much since we were young? I don't know that they have. I was talking to my 4th grader last night. I asked him if he'd ever been sent to the principal's office. He has, sadly. And I asked him about that experience, how that made him feel. And he said it was really scary. I thought I was going to get in trouble. And I said, so how would you have felt if there had been a uniformed police officer sitting in the room with your principal? And he said, what? And he said, oh my gosh, I would have been so scared. I would have been shaking, Mom. I would have been so scared. And he doesn't realize that in a lot of schools there are uniformed cops. Sometimes they're called school resource officers. Sometimes it's just the school district contracting with the local police department to provide security. Schools are becoming a police zone. Kids are getting, the police can do what schools can't, right? They can get them out. They can arrest them on the spot and take them down to our detention center. I represented a child last year who was arrested at school, and his only crime was that he went to school. The day before, he'd gotten in trouble, gone to the principal's office. They called his dad, said, you need to come get him. He said, fine, I'll come down and get him. They didn't say anything to him about being suspended, didn't give him any written notice. So the next day, he gets up, he goes to school. The school says, you're not supposed to be here, you're suspended. Call dad again, dad's at work, can't come down to pick him up again. They arrest him and take him down to the detention center simply for coming to school. And once they get there, of course, I mean, our juvenile court is just an unbelievable maze for these kids and families. It's bloated, it's packed, it's inefficient. They're not being appropriately disciplined and dealt with at school. Finally, children forced out of traditional schools can be forced into what we call alternative schools, which are unmonitored by traditional school districts. They can be detained in our juvenile detention centers and our Department of Youth Services, where quality education is just not a high priority. And the worst part of all of this is that the majority of kids affected by these policies are our most vulnerable kids, disabled, minority, and poor children. So I'm going to turn it over to the panelists now. It's a little background on where we're coming from. I'm going to ask Renuka to start us off and talk about some of these zero tolerance policies.
Great. Good afternoon. So how many of you made a mistake when you were a kid? I need to see a lot of hands raised for this. Now, can you imagine when you were a kid and there are a lot more, 2 hands? Can you imagine no matter how frivolous the mistake or minor, it was given a one-size-fits-all punishment? Zero tolerance policies apply this one-size-fits-all framework to a child whose brain is still developing. We all have heard the established evidence that the frontal lobes are not fully mature until the 20s for children. And those are the lobes that have the decision-making capacity and the foresight to see consequences. So as a community, we must all agree that all of our children need to spend the maximum amount of time in school preparing for their very important futures. We cannot afford to lose days, weeks, months, sometimes years in aggregate to the streets. So as Professor Jordan mentioned, only 66% of school suspensions in the 2010-2011 year were for weapons or drugs, and the other 64% were for disruptive behavior. So I'll call an example just here in the Columbus City School District, where a third grader was suspended for 3 days for answering yeah instead of yes, ma'am to his teacher. And so that's one example. The example that Professor Jordan gave about the middle school honor student in Southwest Ohio that was expelled for 80 days for inadvertently leaving his Swiss Army knife in his backpack coming home from a Boy Scout camping trip. So obviously our school discipline policies do not reflect our collective value on education, our belief that education is a privilege for all kids, and it's a right. It's not a privilege, it's a right. And so we shouldn't be myopic. We should not remove kids from school because it's just a short-term solution. And often many of the children that are removed are the vulnerable ones, the ones that Professor Jordan mentioned, the ones who actually need the stability, the safety, and the structure of school. So let's remove Ohio's zero-tolerance policy from state law and replace that language with some alternative options like positive behavior supports and interventions, which my colleague Sarah Beal from the Ohio Poverty Law Center is going to go in more depth. Because our children's mistakes demand a better focused solution than one size fits all.
Great. Sarah, can you talk to us about the impact of these policies and what you see?
Yeah, so I think it's really important when we're talking about these issues to clarify that, as Renuka and Kim have both said, we're not talking primarily about kids who are engaging in criminal behavior. We're talking about kids who are engaging in kid behavior. We're talking about nonviolent, minor misbehavior. And the other thing I think is really important is that we're not saying kids shouldn't be disciplined for talking back to the teacher or getting into a fight or whatever. We're saying that they shouldn't be removed from school. And the reason we're saying that is because removing children from school is incredibly harmful. It is the number one reason that leads to kids dropping out of school. The number one reason. It's a history of prior suspensions from school for 8th and 9th graders is more powerful indicator of whether that child is going to drop out than whether they're having sex, whether they grew up in poverty, whether they're using drugs. All of that stuff is less important than whether they have a history of getting suspended from school. Now, those things tend to go together because the other thing that I think we need to understand is that where do we think kids go when they're not in school? It's not like they disappear or they go home and do something to better their lives. A lot of times, especially for kids in poor families and tough communities, even in working class, middle class families, parents are at work. Parents are often working more than one job, and they can't take time off to be home from their kids for 3 days because they got suspended for saying yeah instead of yes, ma'am to the teacher. And that was a child that I talked to. He was 9 years old, I believe. So what are kids doing when they're unsupervised? They're very at risk of being recruited by gangs, getting involved in street crime, and actually not just becoming perpetrators of crime, but becoming victims of crime. And the other thing is they're getting arrested in school. And that's the other sort of side of this. That 11-year-old that Kim mentioned that I represented, this was actually not in Columbus, this was in Toledo. She was not just disciplined, she was arrested by a police officer and taken to the juvenile detention center because she refused to put her books on the floor when the principal asked her to. Arrested. She's 11, and that was her third arrest that year. This is not a logical response to child misbehavior. And so the other thing I think is important, it clearly race plays a role in this. I think we're labeling young people, especially young people of color, as criminals rather than viewing them as children. And we're not giving them any room to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. The kind of discipline we employ doesn't teach children what they should have done instead. So some of the solutions, I think, to this problem are, as Renuka mentioned, positive behavior interventions and supports, restorative practices, and these are school-wide systems. They're positive, preventive systems that are focused on changing the climate and the culture in schools. And this requires not just me or Renuka or Charlie or any of us up here talking about it and saying it's a good idea. It requires entire school districts, entire school systems to buy into this idea and to acknowledge that what they're doing doesn't make sense for kids. And I think you'd have a really hard time finding any individual teacher or school principal or administrator who would say, you know, yeah, kicking kids out of school is a really good idea. They might feel like they don't have any other options. And so what I think is really important is that they be given the resources and tools they need to manage behavior appropriately, and not just teach kids how to self-manage their behavior. That's important, but kids also need to learn replacement behaviors. So something you're doing, you know, kids learn really quickly if they don't want to be in math class, how to get out of math class every day, right? Like, we've all been there. So they need to learn that there's some positive alternative for them if they choose not to do that and to stay in math class and try to work toward that. But that's not something they just know on their own. They're children. So positive behavior supports, restorative practices, some of the stuff we're going to talk about really helps teach that and helps create a climate where that's possible. But that really requires everyone in the system to buy in. So.
And Charlie, I think, is going to talk about a little bit of a different issue in the pipeline, and that's the new third grade reading mandate and how it's affecting kids in our schools.
Okay, this is all part of the same piece. First of all, the school to prison pipeline unquestionably is a tragic and extremely disturbing reality that pushes very large numbers of our at-risk children, especially children of color, out of our classrooms and into the juvenile justice system. And in my opinion, it's a moral imperative that we all fight to reduce the number of children caught in this pipeline. So what I want to do today, to be as specific as possible and to be as proactive and direct as possible, is to call on the General Assembly and all of you as constituents of members of the General Assembly to amend, to repeal, and to stop passing laws that disserve our youth and by reducing the likelihood that our children will remain in school. To begin with, of course, is the zero tolerance rules that both Renuka and Sarah have spoken about. It takes away from school board members such as myself the ability to look at the individual situation and decide what's in the best interest of the child. The child, after being expelled, use a real live example from Worthington, a 7th grader brought a taser gun to school. Is that improper behavior? Undoubtedly. Should the child have been disciplined? Undoubtedly. Undoubtedly. But because that is deemed to be a gun under Ohio law, we had no discretion. This is a child that everybody agreed would be in much better shape in school rather than at home in actually a very abusive home situation. A child who was a marginal B/C student who everyone agreed missing school was going to greatly endanger his ability to succeed in school. And yet we as a board had absolutely no discretion to in any way waive or to alleviate that zero policy in state law. Let me use another example that Kim just referred to, the 3rd grade guarantee. Everybody believes that all 3rd graders who have the cognitive ability should certainly be reading at a 3rd grade level in 3rd grade. We're all in agreement on that. There's not a school board member in America that doesn't want every 3rd grader who has the ability to be reading in 3rd grade. And a lot of those children need intervention, a lot of those children need help, a lot of those children are not getting it at home, and it's the schools that have to provide that in most situations. But the solution in Ohio is if the child is not reading at 3rd grade level, we as a school district have absolutely no discretion but to retain that child. We have to retain that child. The parent is excluded from the system. The teacher, the caring, experienced teacher is excluded from that decision. The principal is excluded from the decision. Under Ohio state law that was just passed this summer, Senate Bill 316, we as a school district must retain each and every child who fails to meet a certain score on an objective test, a fill-in-the-bubbles test, notwithstanding maybe that was a child's bad day, notwithstanding the fact that everybody agrees it would be in the child's best interest to move on to 4th grade and to get special intervention for her 3rd grade reading deficiencies. We are all for that, but we are not for a system which, as Sarah indicated, is virtually going to guarantee that child being pushed out. The data are overwhelming. A child who is held back for inappropriate reasons is not going to graduate from high school. The child who does not graduate from high school is going to get involved in our criminal court system. The child who is involved in our criminal court system is likely to become incarcerated. That is that schools to prison pipeline. Those are the 4 steps. And the 3rd grade guarantee, as currently structured in Ohio, is going to push out lots and lots of kids. It's a travesty. It is a moral tragedy if even one child loses the opportunity to realize his or her full potential and is forced into repeating 3rd grade. Just to give you one, I want to give you 2 examples. One example would be Einstein. Einstein wasn't reading at the end of 3rd grade. He was a math genius. I shudder to think what his life would have been like if he'd had to repeat 4th grade math. I mean, this is what repeat 3rd grade math. Couldn't go on to 4th grade math. That is what we're talking about in Ohio. That's just one super extreme example. But what about the child who has a bit of a vision disability that isn't caught until halfway through her 3rd grade year? And it's now realized that she has a vision disability. It's now being corrected. But come test day, you only get one shot at it. It's an objective, standardized test. You don't quite fill out enough of the right bubbles. That child who is on a trajectory to be reading at 3rd grade level, even by the end of 3rd grade, because of the day on the test, she wasn't reading at the level required by the Ohio Department of Education. She's got to be held back. Now, the Ohio School Board Association's had some meeting with legislators about a variety of topics, one of which is the 3rd grade guarantee, and in particular the 3rd grade retention. And one legislator in the majority said that there is serious discussion going on about alleviating the 3rd grade retention. And all I can ask is each and every one of you to contact your legislator to push them to say, wait a minute, let's leave it in the hands of parents, experienced teachers, experienced and caring principals as to whether it's in the child's best interest to repeat 3rd grade because she is not at a 3rd grade level, or whether it might be in her best interest to move on to 4th grade, but we will give her special intervention, special educational services so that she can realize the reading level that we all need to realize our full potential in today's globalized economy.
So, Renuka, we've heard a couple of us have mentioned the impact that this is having on our most vulnerable kids. Can you talk about that for a little bit? What are some of the things that you've seen in terms of the impact on poor children, minority children?
Yeah, we at the Children's Defense Fund, we are working on our Cradle to Prison Pipeline campaign, which encompasses the School to Prison Pipeline campaign, except we start at the beginning of life where we have found in this country, we have a black boy that was born in 2001 has a 1 in 3 chance entering prison in his or her lifetime. A Latino male or female born in 2001 has a 1 in 6 chance in entering prison in his or her lifetime. And so these kind of statistics call to the problems that we're focusing on today, that as Professor Wilson mentioned, that these kids of minority kids, black children, Latino children, Native American children, are disproportionately impacted by some of these policies, specifically zero tolerance policies.
So, Sarah, I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about the restorative practices that you mentioned earlier.
Right. As Renuka just mentioned, kids with disabilities, particularly African American kids, but also Latino kids, and kids from economically disadvantaged backgrounds in Ohio are all between 2 and something like 8 times more likely to be suspended from school. And that's for doing the same thing as a similarly situated white kid or kid with no disability. So we're not talking about, a lot of times people say, well, the black kids must just do a lot more bad things. And that's not true, and that's not what the data has shown us. The data shows that kids are getting in trouble primarily for engaging in disobedient or disruptive behavior. That's not violence, that's not guns, that's not weapons, that's not drugs, it's not all of the bad stuff we think about when we think about school discipline and Columbine and all of that. That's talking back to the teacher, running in the hallway, you know, whatever, saying yeah instead of yes ma'am, whatever it is. And I think that the problem is that kids get labeled troublemakers pretty early, and as we all know, race and background and all of that, I think plays a role in that. I wouldn't say that individual teachers or individual administrators or individual school board members are racist, but they're operating a racist system. You know, we live in a racist system, and we need to acknowledge that. We need to be able to say that and acknowledge it and do something about it. We can't be afraid to say that kind of stuff. And so the idea that we can address this just by, I think, eliminating zero tolerance policies should be our absolute first step. We should eliminate the state law. I think we should replace it with language encouraging schools to adopt positive behavior interventions and supports or restorative practices or a similar preventive positive model. But we also need to really think about adjusting our whole approach to the system. And that's not something that's easy to do. It's attitude change, it's culture change. It's not something that happens overnight. The Ohio Department of Education just recently put out a proposed policy, which it is accepting comments on until, I think, tonight. If you feel like going to look at it, it's on their website. Their proposed policy would mandate that schools look at adopting positive behavior interventions and supports. And the reason they're proposing that is because the evidence that we've seen, the research that's being done, shows that it works. In school districts that adopt it and adopt it correctly, the other thing I worry about is that, you know, phrases like positive behavior interventions become sort of popular and cliched, and people start saying them and using them to describe things that are not a system of positive preventive approaches to discipline. They start talking about, well, we have a reward system in our classroom. Well, that's not what PBIS is. Reward systems might work great for a lot of kids. They're not going to work for all kids. So the idea is that you have to have school-wide, this has to be a school-wide thing, it can't be classroom to classroom, because the most important thing is that kids have to have consistency, and the adults that they're interacting with have to be modeling that behavior for them. So it takes a long time to implement, and it requires school districts to really overhaul and rethink how they do things. But the thing is, you know, it's hard, it's not easy. You know, we need to be investing in training for administrators and teachers to do this stuff, and that's not free usually. So it's not like, you know, it's not like I can say, snap your fingers and you can fix this problem. But the thing is, the alternative, I don't think anyone thinks the alternative is a good idea. The only argument I can think of in favor of keeping our current system in place, our current overemphasis on suspension and expulsion, is because that's how we've been doing it. And that's a terrible reason to do anything, right? Because it doesn't work, and the data shows that. So implementing new systems is really important. And just to say a few other things about other kinds of positive alternatives, creating a preventive discipline system, modeling and teaching kids appropriate behavior is really important. But we also have to look at, there's actually an article that I read recently about a high school in Washington State that decided to de-emphasize suspension and expulsion, and sort of this principal just sort of realized that there's this thing called toxic stress that's impacting a lot of the kids in his school. And that means that they've had a lot of trauma in their young lives. You know, kids who grow up in poverty, kids who grow up in rough neighborhoods have a lot of trauma in their lives. And I think we're only just beginning to understand how trauma impacts brain development in young children, particularly before the age of 5, because something like 95% of the connections in your brain are formed by the time you turn 5. That's before you enter school, right? So when kids are exposed to trauma at those young ages, it can impact the way they learn and the way they behave for the rest of their lives. And so this principal in Washington started thinking about that and tried to take an approach that sort of recognized and understood that, and so started giving kids, responding with compassion when they would come to school grumpy and lashing out, giving them an opportunity for just time out. You just need to step away and get yourself together rather than immediately punishing them for talking back or some of those more minor things. They reduced school suspensions in this high school after they adopted this program by 85%. It doesn't take, it's not rocket science, I guess is the point. It's not like it's super hard to figure out. We have proven models that show that we can do this, but it does take community will. And it's not just, I think me as a lawyer standing up and saying that this is important isn't all that impactful. I think we need to get parents, students, educators, administrators, we need to get them involved, and they need to have a voice in implementing these kinds of things. Because if it's just a bunch of legislators and policymakers and lawyers saying this is what you should do, I don't think that that's a particularly effective way to approach it. So the other thing I would say is we need to organize our communities and get them involved in doing this work too.
So the other thing that we talked about a little bit in the opening is the overpresence of police and school resource officers in schools, and so I wanted to get your take on that too. Charlie, does on the school board in my district in Worthington, do they have school resource officers?
We don't have school resource officers, at least at this time, and again, for a very, very good reason. Number one, the school district has to pay for it, and we can frankly hire school psychologists and counselors for a lot less money and be a whole lot more effective in the long-term success of each and every child if we go that route. Okay, a school resource officer, too much jargon here in academia and education policy, but a school resource officer is generally a licensed police officer, often a uniformed police officer, who's actually stationed in the hallways of our schools to walk up and down the hallways of our schools. As I said, we don't have that in Worthington, but another hat I wear is that of a law professor at Ohio State. Back in the 80s, when I was often on the admissions committee at Ohio State, it was not unusual for us to have applicants who had gotten in trouble while in school. And because at that time, at least, the Ohio Supreme Court was extremely strict on people with a felony record of any kind not being able to be admitted to the bar, we didn't admit such students. And there's one case that was particularly profound and disturbing to me. And this gets to Reneka's point about the effect of the disparate impact of the zero tolerance policies and school resource officers on poor children and children of color. What happened was this, and we know nothing about the facts except that when he was 16 years old in a chemistry class, he dropped a tray of beakers and test tubes that amounted to more than $500. That was a felony, at least at that time in Ohio, to destroy more than $500 worth of public property. And as a consequence, the uniformed police officer in that school immediately arrested him, and he was put in the juvenile court system, and he had a felony record on his record. This was a young African-American male who had a 3.95 GPA in college. He had one of the highest law school admissions test scores I ever saw on the admissions committee, and yet we were unable to admit him because he stood no chance of being admitted to the bar because of and I know nothing about the facts, but of something he did as a 16-year-old. As I recall just a few minutes ago, many of you raised your hands that you had done something inappropriate, silly, maybe even criminal in school. But the disparate impact is that had that been my child who dropped $500 worth of test tubes and beakers, I am quite confident the police officer would not have been the first person called. I'm quite confident that it would either have been my wife or me who would have been called, and we would have taken care of it. And I am 100% confident there would have been no police record as a result of destroying $500 worth of beakers. That wouldn't have happened. My son would not have a police record. My son would not be facing those kinds of lifetime consequences for something that occurred in a school. Kids are silly. Kids do stupid things. I'm a school board member. I hear about those all the time. And some of them, frankly, if done out by an adult out in public, are crimes. But we've got to stop criminalizing stupid activities, impulsive activities by children. Children push each other. If I push somebody on the street, that's an assault, and I probably should be, a police officer should be obtained, probably a psychiatric if I were to push anybody, but you get the point. Kids do stupid things. Let's stop criminalizing them, because then we're into the zero tolerance policies. We've got to kick them out of school. Who is that helping? It's helping absolutely no one except increasing our lifetime incarceration costs. It's all about increasing our future expenses. Let's educate the kids. Let's stop pushing them out.
Maybe we should talk about, I mean, sometimes folks are like, well, how did you get from one short suspension to prison? And so maybe we should give a little bit more clarity, because what happens is if a young man or a young woman gets a short suspension and then he or she is labeled a bad kid, right? And so then, and we all need to sort of think about when that label's put on a young person and a teacher or principal is already overstressed and overworked and having to deal with numbers and numbers of kids. And so that label is sort of in the back of the mind of that administrator or teacher or principal, and then something happens again. And then because something happened with the suspension, now it's an expulsion or it's a longer term school discipline or a removal from school. And so then it continues down a path that, if not stopped early, and if there isn't a preventative measure taken, we start to have these kids go to detention centers, and then detention centers, short misdemeanors turn into, possibly, if not given the right therapeutic or the needs the young person needs, turn into something much worse. And then, you know, we're talking about DYS. And so I think that kind of understanding a continuum of a cradle to prison pipeline is important for folks.
Yeah, you're missing one step, though, I think that's critical. Often these are children that are not our academic superstars, and that 3 to 5 day suspension for some C students is enough to push that student into the flunking category, which is then into the category of should we retain the student. And the data are overwhelming, as I said before, that the chances of an improperly retained student or a student retained where it's not for that student's best interest, that student's going to end up caught into that pipeline on the continuum, ultimately incarcerated.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I need to say anything more than 82% of the adults in our prison system did not graduate from high school. That is what happens to people who don't graduate from high school. It's not a good outcome.
So we're approaching 1 o'clock, and you notice that there's a microphone up here. Be thinking of your questions for our panelists. We're going to talk for a few more minutes while you formulate your thoughts, but feel free to step up and ask a question if you've got something pressing on your mind. The other piece that
I'm going to help out here so Kim can also answer questions.
That's great. So the other thing that I wanted to say about the school to prison pipeline is the piece that I see. My students represent kids down in the juvenile court, and if you've never been to our juvenile court, it's quite an experience. It's down in our old court building, not in the fancy new one. We're in the old one across the street, and if you go up on the 5th floor any day at 9 o'clock, you'll see all the kids that are there for court that day. Some of them are there because of abuse, neglect, dependency cases, but the majority of them are there because they've been charged with some sort of crime, from truancy to some sort of violent crime, and they're all sent there at the same time. Their parents are all cited to come with them. If they don't have childcare, there's young kids running around in the hallway. It's a recipe for disaster. And I think I forget how bad it looks until I have a new crop of students every semester, and we go down and we see what it looks like, and they are floored. Their mouths hit the floor. They can't believe that this is the system that's handling our kids. Kids get 2 to 3 minutes in the courtroom with the magistrate hearing their case. They get the little snippet that the prosecutor gives them. They get the little snippet that the defense attorney is able to give them, and then they've got to make a decision. And so then, and as kids are put on probation, the penalties ratchet up. And what I like to say to kids is, you may not feel like it's a big deal to plead to this minor misdemeanor, whatever it is, but if you don't do what the court tells you to do, then you're back here on a contempt. You're back here on a probation violation, and they continue to ratchet things up until you turn 18. And then what they say is, forget it. We've tried. You failed. You're 18. Just go do your 30 days in our county jail, and we'll see you. Good luck in the adult system. So I think that we've got some people here who want to ask some questions. If you want to go ahead.
Let me remind everybody that's in line that CMC records all of its forums for broadcast on YouTube, streaming on CMC's website and the Columbus Metropolitan Library website. While asking your questions, introduce yourself. We thank you in advance for not making long editorial comments.
I'm Margie Harris. I'm a retired educator. And one thing I want to say before I get to what I do want to say is that there are a lot of wonderful educators out there and a lot of wonderful classrooms where we care to the depths of our heart about each and every child. That's one thing. Two, I so agree with Charlie Wilson, and I would go further to say we need to get the legislators out of education. They are making education a political ball, and they all have to say what they think is going to help to get them elected by saying the right thing about education. And we need to get them out. They don't know what they're talking about. It would be as if they were telling surgeons how to do an operation. They don't know what they're talking about. But what I really want to say is this. I happen to serve on grand jury duty. And as the 2 weeks wore on, now grand jury duty is where you're not really on a jury, it's not a whole trial. It's just whether or not there's enough evidence that the person should go to trial. But as the 2 weeks wore on, my heart was breaking. The kids, just like you're saying, are in this pipeline where they go straight from being kids to being felons, and they don't even know what's happened to them. Your example was perfect, you know, dropping over $500 worth of something. If a child, well, say an 18-year-old, 19-year-old would grab a purse from you, it wouldn't be a felony. If they grabbed it from me, it would be a felony. And then they would have a felony because of our age difference. And this is what I'd like to say. I think what constitutes a felony should be taught in schools, because a lot of these young men who have had a bad experience already, they don't even realize what's going to create a felony that will be on their record for the rest of their lives. And I think it should be a part of our social studies, especially in every inner city school, all the cities, all schools. They should know, just like with financial education, they should know what constitutes a felony for them and don't do it. You know, so many of them I would think, oh, these are just dumb kids that got into so much trouble. Because when a crime is committed, they rack up every single thing around that crime and increase the felony levels.
I hate to interrupt.
Okay, that's all I have to say.
Yeah, thank you.
You know, just to respond quickly to that, one of my favorite things I've done professionally since I became a lawyer was when I was in Chicago, I co-taught a street law class at an inner city high school with a government teacher, and it was probably the best experience of my life. I learned so much from those kids, but they love knowing what the law is and what it's not. So I think teaching kids not just about felonies, but about how landlord-tenant law works and family law and all of that stuff is really important. And so I'm pretty sure Ohio State and I think Capital both have street law programs. So if you work with a school, encourage them to have a street law class come in.
Yes, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Robert Caldwell. Good to see you again, Charlie. Our common friend, Dr. Lester Jipp, who is a passionate advocate for Uri Bronfenbrenner and the human development science, which I guess created the philosophical basis for the credit flex option here in Ohio. You know, he advocates that we recognize the Family Civic Engagement Council's aspect of the credit flex option, particularly as a basis for, you know, connecting schools and families in the community. But I'm seeing the possibility of it becoming a context for advocacy for some of the reform that you all are recommending. How would you see the role of credit flex? And if I recall, I think the Family Civic Engagement Council component was actually removed by Governor Kasich in, most recently. But how would you see that piece of legislation or that piece of policy contributing to the advocacy that you all are calling for?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it is opportunities for us to speak like this, forums that I was on with your two sons, to educate people to understand that, as our first speaker said, it isn't for the General Assembly to be setting educational policy. How about leaving it to trained, educated, experienced educators to set it? And yeah, so I think that engaging our parents, because they're constituents as well, to understand exactly what's going on, because they've taken all the discretion away from the trained educators. They're not the ones now deciding whether or not it's in the best interest of a poorly reading third grader to repeat third grade or to move on, or a child who makes a mistake in school by having a knife in his backpack, or, in my opinion, a horrible mistake, bringing a taser gun to school. Again, but that shouldn't necessitate the expulsion of the kid in middle school.
And just to quickly add on to that, I think, as Charlie mentioned, it's not enough just to have trained educators making policies, but I really think that, most of the good reform I've seen across the country in this area has come because parents and students in their communities organized and really demanded and worked with their school districts to make changes to policies. So when I think that anytime you're talking about policy change, you need to have the people who are going to be impacted by the policies the most. The students and the parents and the families in these communities have to be involved.
Good afternoon, everyone. Excuse me. My name is Michael Hargrove. I'm founder and CEO of Dads Incorporated. We're a parent education and community outreach firm here in Columbus, Ohio. I'm not here to speak to you as a business or some organization or from a political standpoint. I started my company because as a single father at the time, there were no resources specifically in Columbus, Ohio area that I could go to figure out how to correct the mistake that I made by not providing the best possible parenting environment day one for my daughter. So after starting it, first thing I thought was, hey, maybe PTA and things of that nature. And at this point now, I've found the Columbus Council of PTA, for example, as not only a parent, but as a community organization who can go to a organization who has day-to-day contact with the administrators, teachers, and really the whole real microcosm, if you would, of the school systems. So my question to you is, if I didn't do what I did, for example, and I wasn't as proactive and didn't know where to go, I'm asking as a parent. My daughter lives in Cleveland, and so I have to go even there to participate in her PTA. What can I do as a parent, specifically in Columbus, Ohio, to go to say, hey, I'm a mom, I'm a dad, I don't know what laws are out there, I don't read that stuff every day. Are there specific resources or specific parent organizations within the school funded by our tax dollars that I can go be a part of outside of the Columbus Council of PTAs, who does a wonderful job, but their resources are limited, and they can't literally, say, hey, we got 1 million parents in the school system, let's help you. What would you suggest? Again, not as any other organization, but as a parent, I want help. Tell me exactly where to go. Thank you.
I think that's a great question. So I think there are some decent resources for parents online. There's some decent information out there. I don't think it's all in one place or very easy to find. But I think that parents are most powerful when they work together. I think that as an individual parent, you can read up on what the state's suspension and expulsion law says, because, for example, I see a lot of suspensions and expulsions that don't follow the state law. There are specific procedures set out, and so you can very easily challenge an individual suspension or expulsion based on the state law if you know where it is. And there's a website with a list of all of our state laws, codes.ohio.gov, that has the text of all of the state laws. So that's an easy one. Look at the laws, read them, know what they say. But the other thing is, I think banding together with other parents is really powerful, because I think that if you have one person requesting a meeting with your school principal or your school superintendent, that's one thing, and I wouldn't discourage you from doing that. But if you have a group of 20 or 30 parents who are all concerned about the same thing requesting that meeting, I think it's a lot more powerful. And I'll give a shout out to the Columbus branch of the NAACP, because Noelle Williams is sitting right here in front of me. I spoke at the NAACP's Back to School conference back in August and was encouraging parents to do that. But I think organizations like the NAACP or other organizations, where people in communities get together and talk about problems are a good place to sort of incubate those issues and really bring them forward. And I offered then, and I would offer again now, that I would love to come to a meeting and give you data, give you information, help you sort of get the information you need to go out there and be the spokespeople for this issue, because I would much rather it be you and other parents than be me.
And just to follow up. I mean, that's part of what we do at the Children's Defense Fund is to help organize the advocacy efforts. And so I'd like to give a shout out to a policy brief that we're going to put out very shortly with the Ohio Poverty Law Center after the election, because I think more folks will be focused on these issues after the election. And we can welcome our new elected leaders with a nice brief laying out all the challenges that they have to help us solve. So we're going to connect after we put this out, and we'd love to have you come join us in our advocacy efforts.
Yeah, I mean, our policy brief focuses on statewide data, and it has the 8 largest urban school districts data. But I am always happy to give people, I have a bunch of Columbus City Schools data sitting on my computer at my office, and I'm always happy to email you all the Excel spreadsheets and charts. I really did just pull it off of the Ohio Department of Education website. It's all out there. It's just figuring out what to do with it and sort of what it means. And so I'm not feeling proprietary about that at all. I'm happy to send out what I've pulled out of there. So.
Hi, my name is Joshua Weir. I have a company called Transform. We're a construction company. First of all, I just want to say CMC is awesome. I'm a couple months old in this organization. This is great. This forum is great. Question I have is we're kind of addressing the front end of the pipeline, which I think is obviously essential. I came not knowing what to expect, but wanting more input or more thoughts about the back end of the pipeline, which is, owning a construction company, I feel like I've got an opportunity to bring on, because I'm very interested in not only helping the buildings we do, but also the people I can employ people who have felonies. I don't really care as long as they have good, ethics. They really want to do work. We're talking, this is a systemic shift that needs to happen, which could take 10 years. What about all the kids who are already in the system, who are already on their way to prison? Like, I would love to hear how a business owner like myself who wants to be involved in I guess helping someone who's already in the system, who doesn't care about the felonies, those kinds of things. So I don't know if you guys can address that, maybe some things you know about.
Well, let me say one positive thing about something that happened in our legislature. We recently passed a bill, and the governor signed it, and it went into effect at the end of September, that lets kids off the hook a lot sooner. It used to be that kids had to wait 2 years to get these minor things off of their records, to get them sealed and expunged through the court, and now it's crunched down to 6 months. So the kids that I see and all of my clients, I'm certainly going to try to be getting these things off their records before they turn 18. They don't have to wait until after 18 anymore. Get them off so that they're out of the system and their record is clean, and they're starting with a clean slate.
Yeah, I mean, as you, I'm sure, know, there are a whole host of basically just professions, jobs, that people who have felony convictions are completely exempt from. They cannot get those jobs. And it's not just getting admitted to law school, as Charlie was talking about. It's a whole range of things. One of the things that I know my office has been working on, and I am no expert on this stuff, but I know we've been working on it, is a Ban the Box initiative. And the idea behind that is to get employers to stop asking on employment applications whether people have a felony conviction. You can discover that later in the process, but cities that have implemented that with their municipal hiring, for example, have seen huge increases in the number of people with prior convictions getting hired because you're not automatically sort of kicked off the list and not considered because you checked yes on that box. So, it doesn't replace background checks or mean that we don't look at that at all, but it just means it's not an immediate disqualification. And so that's an effort that I think can help with that too.
I think we've got time for one more question if I don't.
Okay, I did not have a question. I just wanted to make a comment. My name is Diana Lee, and I work with the Girl Scouts of Ohio's Heartland, and I work with a program that is called Bonds Beyond Bars program, where I'm working with children who are at risk, girls whose mothers are incarcerated. And yes, some of them, when they come into our program, have been into the suspension and issues of getting expelled from school, but through our program and a lot of help with mentoring these girls, they have become a productive girl in Girl Scouts and in their community by promoting their actions or improving their actions and making healthier choices.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great.
I hope everyone enjoyed today's forum. A lot of information that we all need to know and bring more to top of mind. You can see this again and share it with others on YouTube, or there's a link on our CMC website. Want to also encourage you, slipping into something more humorous, to sign up for next week's program on the Royal Shakespeare Company. It ought to be a lot of fun. You don't have to come in costume. I want to invite you to continue today's conversation because there's a lot of it going on out in our lobby with some coffee and cookies out there. I want to thank Sarah, Charlie, Renuka, and Kim for your participation today. Thank you so much. Very informative. I want to recognize Mayor Coleman, who's sitting up here listening taking it all in. Lastly, we are a green organization. Please put your name tags in the basket in the lobby as you exit. Thanks so much.